Are you serious? Are you serious? Everybody get some coffee and calm down. But Nikki Haley is not calming down. She's extremely upset at the dire consequences over the Syria military assault that's being done right now by the Iranians and the Russians. Matter of fact, and Assad for that matter. Here's what's going on. U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations, Nikki Haley, has just warned Russia and Iran of dire consequences if they continue the airstrikes against this last rebel-held area there in Syria in Idlib province. She said the U.S. would respond if any use of chemical weapons is done. But Russia's ambassador to the United Nations met Haley's threat with a denial that Syria has any chemical weapons, as the United Nations Secretary General warned of a potential bloodbath during last night's UN Security Council meeting on the crisis in Idlib, Syria. During what was the second session on Idlib in 4 days, Haley told the council that the world has seen a clear military escalation in this month by Russia and the Syrian regime, whose forces have conducted more than 100 airstrikes on the civilian population there. Of course, they're not going for the civilians. They're going for the terrorists, okay? They're going for those that are a part of the of ISIS and some of the other groups that are embedded among the civilians. But the barrel bombs, the rockets, and the artillery in an attempt to retake the last rebel stronghold and holdout there in Idlib during this 7-year war that's been going on in Syria. Haley accused Russia and Iran of having little interest in the political solution and called their actions those of cowards instead of in a bloody military conquest. Quote, if Assad, Russia, and Iran continue down this path they are on, the consequences will be dire, she said. I also want to reiterate what I said last week, Nikki Haley said, to the Assad regime and anyone else contemplating the use of chemical weapons in Syria. The United States follows through when we said that we would respond to the use of chemical weapons, and we are standing by this warning. Matter of fact, Secretary of Defense James Mad Dog Mattis declined to say whether the United States would take military action against Syrian regime should it use chemical weapons. But he did say Syrian leader Bashar al-Assad has been warned. Now, I'm not going to tell the world ahead of time what we're going to do. It's just not my style, said Mattis, when asked if and what kind of retaliation the United States military would carry out should the regime use chemical weapons in its offensive against Idlib. I never talk about what would come next, Mattis said, but I think that you have to look at the fact that we will abide by the chemical weapons prohibition and support it. When asked what the U.S. has done to prevent their use, Mattis referred to the United States, the United Kingdom, and the French strikes on Syria after the chemical weapon attack back in April. And Assad has been warned, Mattis said. The first time around, he lost 17% of his pointy-nosed Air Force airplanes. And he's been warned, and so we'll see if he's wised up. Now, this is becoming a humanitarian nightmare, and Mattis declined to confirm whether he has been in consultations with the United Kingdom or France on any of the military response so far, but the crisis in Idlib has the potential to unleash a humanitarian nightmare unlike any seen in the blood-soaked Syrian conflict. This Arab Spring has cost so many people their lives in Iraq, in Syria, in Yemen, in Tunisia, in Egypt, in Libya, in Yemen. I mean, it just doesn't end, okay? But certainly Syria. where it's been horrible. Matter of fact, UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres said last night, noting that there's been close to 1 million children that live in Idlib, part of the wave of the internally displaced Syrians who fled there to escape the violence somewhere else in the country. Idlib is the last so-called de-escalation zone in Syria. Guterres said it must not be transformed into a bloodbath. The Russian and Syrian strikes have already displaced more than 30,000 people, and forces are targeting hospitals and other medical facilities. What? So Haley added that pro-regime forces are also conducting ruthless double-tap strikes on civilian volunteers like the White Helmets, in which they strike an area, wait a few moments for the first responders to arrive, and then strike again, killing the emergency responders. The United States is long past taking Russia and Iran at their word that they are generally interested in protecting the civilians of Idlib from further violence. Haley said, no matter what type of weapons or methods are used, the United States is strongly opposed of any escalation of violence in Idlib. And during his remarks, Russian Ambassador Vasily repeated the claim that Syria has no chemical weapons, and said it would be a folly on a humanitarian and political basis for the Assad regime to use chemical weapons, as it would prompt the U.S. and others to attack inside of Syria. He also blamed the terrorists for forcing the government to move on Idlib, a claim rejected by the United States and other nations, which argue that Russia and Assad regime are using the label to justify their military offensives. Fighting terrorism does not absolve warring parties of their core obligations under international law, says Guterres, who directly appeals to Iran, to Russia, and to Turkey to spare no effort to protect the civilians, preserve basic services such as hospitals, ensure full respect for international humanitarian law. Notice here that the UN Secretary General brings up not only Russia and Iran, but he brings up Turkey. Notice those three nations are the main three that make up the Battle of Gog and Magog. And now, as I told you, they've been working together, they've been holding summits together, and they're all three in on this Idlib situation. Now, CNN reported last week that the United States officials have grown worried that an assault on Idlib could involve the use of chemical weapons if the rebels are able to slow regime advances. The Assad regime has moved armed helicopters closer to Idlib in recent weeks, according to two defense officials. The United States is concerned they could eventually be used to launch another chemical attack as well as conventional assaults. Now, Russian diplomats also summed up last week's summit among Russia, Turkey, and Iran as a major milestone in restoring peace and ensuring lasting settlement in Syria. The three countries had failed to reach an agreement for a ceasefire, however, prompting that Sweden and other nations to again warn of a humanitarian catastrophe should the Syrian government, backed by Russia, wage a military offensive on Idlib, where millions are at risk. Haley said the failed summit was another indication that Russia, Iran, and Syria are not interested in the political solution, telling the council that those parties have had every opportunity to demonstrate their credibility as constructive actors in Syria. Russia, Iran, and Assad are demolishing Idlib and asking us to call it peace. She said, we will know that the Assad regime and its enablers are serious about a political process for peace in Syria, not when they repeat their empty promises, but when they act. So obviously, Nikki Haley and the Trump administration very upset, sending a strong warning to Russia, to Iran, and to Assad of the dire consequences that they could face, and certainly the horrific loss of life and devastation to the city and Providence area of Idlib. Pray for peace, folks. We're seeing the Middle East is up in smoke, and it's not just the Middle Eastern nations fighting each other, but of course it's the United States and the Russians using proxies to square off at one another. It's an ugly world. It's a dangerous world. But it is the world we live in. It is the last days. The Bible said there would be wars and rumors of wars. Nations would rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom. We're in that day today. Give your life to Jesus Christ. He's coming soon. He's coming sooner than any of us would care to realize.